You know, Bill asked me some time ago if I would come and speak, and he said the meeting was at 8 o'clock. I said, oh, great. And then he said, well, it's 8 a.m. I said, well, wait a minute. Let's not rush into this. So it took me almost a year to say yes to that. I came here last October and was impressed with the group and the speaker, and so I agreed to come back and talk about my work a little bit. As Bill said, I was in Taos, New Mexico for 23 years. I moved there from Washington, D.C., and my intention was to, I was in the car business in Washington, D.C. I can still get you a deal on a car. I went from D.C., I was a manager at a car dealership, and taking pictures on my one day off. And I took a visit to Taos, New Mexico with a friend who was looking to move there. And I was a couple of years into photography, and I loved taking pictures of the Southwest, and I loved Taos. I went back home and after the trip, and I was flipping through an Arizona Highways magazine at my desk, and I had this flashback as a kid of, I don't know, maybe around 10. And I had my bedroom wall covered in pictures of the Southwest. My mom's boss, Jack C., would send old Arizona Highways magazines home with her. And so I covered my bedroom. And I forget all of this until a month after my trip to Taos, and I'm sitting at my desk, and I'm looking through this magazine, and I go, wow, I've got to move. 6 months later, you know, I traded a new car for a truck, and brought the new girlfriend, who became the old girlfriend after we got to Taos. But anyway, I went to Taos, and I figured I would try to find my way into a new career. My passion was photography because it gave me peace. From the very first rolls of film that I shot, going out into nature, I felt at peace, and I hadn't had that in many years, working in that kind of business and living the life I was living. Anyway, so I figured I would go to Taos for a bit, about a year or so, right? 23 years later, I'm moving from Taos. I call it the long year. That's a pretty long stretch. But anyway, I was in Taos for 23 years, and I learned my craft. Taos is an art-centered town, so I'm surrounded by creative people, which I really love. And I learned how to live the creative life. I learned my medium, but I also learned how to live the creative life. And as with any life, you know, it's like this. So living the creative life, you got to be creative about living the creative life, the ebb and flow. So I have many bodies of work from New Mexico, the architecture, which is wonderful, I love, the landscape, the life in Taos. If you haven't been, this gentleman said he's spent time in Taos and would love to go back. The light is incredible. Artists for a couple of hundred years will go out there because of the light. So I love learning. I love being out on the land, and I love the spirit of the place and the peace. And a lot of my imagery spoke to that. You know, it's at times seems like a crazy world out there, and maybe even more crazier between the ears. So the imagery I would try to create always brought me peace, and I wanted to share that, and I think was fairly successful at that. But the time came, I had to visit my parents here in Palm Coast, and the time came that I should get close to them. They were in their upper 80s, and I thought maybe it's time to get close to them and close to the ocean for a while. So I left a thriving business and life in Taos and came to St. Augustine. And when I got to St. Augustine, I knew little to nothing of the history of Florida, the history of St. Augustine, and in particular the African American history and civil rights history, which, you know, African American history is some of the oldest in the country. I had no idea of that. And at one point, I was here about a year and a half, and then I moved to Lincolnville. It's the first township, first community for freed slaves in the country. And I moved into Lincolnville, and in the evenings I would ride my bike around, and I discovered the Freedom Trail markers. There's a museum in Lincolnville, the Accord Freedom Trail Museum, the Accord Civil Rights Museum, and they have Freedom Trail markers throughout the town in front of buildings and or locations, historic locations. So I would ride my bike in the evening, and I discovered just 3 blocks down from my apartment that was a church that Dr. King spoke, preached. Actually, there were 2 churches, St. Paul's AME Church, and right behind it is First Baptist Church. Both of those now are historic churches. He also did strategic planning across the street at St. Benedict the Moor, the first Catholic church for African Americans in the country. And I also discovered that Jackie Robinson King also, he was a big civil rights advocate. He also spoke at St. Paul's AME Church. I discovered that Andrew Young had, at the request of Dr. King, came to St. Augustine on a couple of occasions. Discovered, of course, that Ralph Abernathy had been to St. Augustine. But then I got this idea. This was right around the time I was discovering these stories, and it was right around the time that Colin Kaepernick, professional football player, he started taking a knee during the national anthem in protest, not of the country or the flag, but he was doing a peaceful protest against police brutality against people of color. And there were many people that understood what that was and what that was about, and there were others that strongly disagreed with that and thought it was a disrespectful thing. And that was happening, and at the same time I'm discovering this history here and how long we as a people had been in Florida, had been in St. Augustine, and especially in getting into the civil rights era, and what happened there was some of the most important in the country. And so I'm discovering this, and one night I thought, I didn't know these stories, and there are probably many other people that don't know these stories, so I want to start storytelling. You know, I've hopefully have honed my craft over the last 30 years, taking beautiful pictures, and I thought I would take my skill set and apply that to this storytelling of valuable history. So I thought I want to share, I want to tell stories about where we stand, why we march, why we sit in, why we swim in, why we protest, why we pray, why we sing, why we dance. And so the Where We Stand series was born. The first image I created for the series, and this was one of my 3 a.m. ideas. You know, I wake up at 3 a.m. like, oh, there you go.
He's waking up too.
Like clockwork. I wake up at 3 a.m. and I come up with great ideas at 3 a.m. There are some that are not so great, but this was one of them. And so I started this series with an image of a man who would frequently ride by my gallery, and I had a pair of shackles that my sister had brought back from West Africa, and I photographed them on the bricks of what is historically known as the slave market, where Africans were first sold in one of the first places Africans were sold in the country. So I placed those shackles on the bricks of the slave market, and it was a powerful image, but not enough. And so I got the idea, what I need are feet. And so this is a guy who used to ride by all the time. He was kind of a street guy, and I asked him, brother, can I take a picture of your feet? He did like this. He backed up. I said, no, it's not that kind of party. But we went to the slave market, and I took a picture of his feet with the shackles in front, and the most powerful image. And that's spurred me on to kind of tell other stories that was not the beginning, but near the beginning of African American history on the continent. So I began with each story that I learned from the Freedom Trail markers from the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center in Lincolnville. If you ever get to St. Augustine, that's a must stop, must see. The Court Civil Rights Museum, Fort Mose, I would go to these places and I would get pieces of information, of stories and of people. I did a lot of Googling, I still do, to find out about what happened in St. Augustine, and more so stories that aren't typically known. So I began my journey, and so I needed shoes, and I started collecting shoes. Fortunately, there was a thrift store next door to my gallery, and I was a frequent flyer over there. So my idea was that in order to tell these stories, I wanted to use shoes as part of the storytelling mechanism. So I thought, what better way than to place shoes in these situations, in these historic locations, and the shoes are representing historical people, some of them, because I thought by doing so, it might be easier for people to access the history, the story. It might be easier for them to stand in someone's shoes for a minute. You know, if you can stand in someone's shoes, you're probably less likely to judge them. And also, the shoes, besides being the subject in the imagery, I thought the shoes might make it easier for people to be a witness to what was happening at that moment. So we began, and Bill mentioned this first image, which I call it First Steps at Fort Mose. And there's a little narrative with each image, if you care to come up afterwards. This was one of the earlier images from the series. And Lauren kind of loves this story. She inspired me to tell it last night, and I forgot, but I will now. One of the images I created was about the first people, Africans, who were brought over from Spain and Portugal, and also some of the free African Americans who were making their way down from the Carolinas and Georgia to become free in Spanish Florida. So I wanted to tell that story. And there's a noted historian in St. Augustine, David Nolan. It'd be good to look him up. A brilliant man, and he's been involved in civil rights history, African American history since the early 60s. He heard of my series, and so he brought me on the silver platter these shoe remnants, and he told the story of these shoe pieces, these remnant soles were found in field dirt near City Hall in the Leitner Museum. And Henry Flagler had, when he was building his hotels, and he brought field dirt from Fort Mose, that first colony of freed Africans. He brought field dirt down to downtown. And a couple of years ago, they were excavating around City Hall, and they found these shoe remnants. And fortunately, someone contacted David Nolan, or somehow he found out about it. So he grabbed it, because I'm sure over the years, many of these artifacts were just tossed. And so David Nolan brought them to me, and he was so excited. He was shaking when he walked in the door because he knew the significance. So he brought these soles to me, and he told me the story that these shoes were found in Fort Mose field dirt around the City Hall. And they hadn't, at this point, they hadn't been dated, but I think that someone's about to. Obviously, they came from Fort Mose, and so I took the shoe remnants back out to Fort Mose, and it had this beautiful, really spiritual, and that's a spiritual place too. I had this beautiful spiritual experience of laying them on the ground from which they came and photographing them. And I met Peace, and the park ranger comes flying up in his truck with lights flashing. it's time to go. We're closing, which ended that sweet spiritual. I was like, oh, okay, dude, I'm creating something here. But anyway, so that was the beginning. So my journey has been to find out what happened in St. Augustine, who was there, and why they were there. And we move into the 60s, and I had no idea that what happened in St. Augustine in the 60s is probably some of the most significant civil rights history there is, because those actions, like Dr. King thought it was one of these most segregated cities in the country, and it became one of the most violent. That's because some of the initial civil rights actions were taking place in St. Augustine, and I think beginning in 63, when some of the protests first started. And there were varied protests. There were a number of marches. There were, Bill mentioned the swim-in, civil rights activists at the Monson Motor Lodge, swimming there. There were also, at Dr. King's request, there were his good friend, Rabbi Dresner, Israel Dresner, I think was his name. Dr. King asked the rabbi to bring 15 rabbis to help with the protest. And so 16 rabbis came to St. Augustine, and they did a peaceful, prayerful protest at the Monson Motor Lodge, and all of them were arrested. Also, Bill mentioned that Reverend Andrew Young was nearly beaten to death walking across the plaza to talk to, there were civil rights activists on their way to march around the plaza, and white supremacists and the Klan were in the plaza, and Reverend Young walked across to try to calm the situation, and he was nearly beaten to death on the sidewalk. So with that story, I have an image depicting that as well. And there was also the St. Augustine Beach swim-in. It was, of course, a segregated beach. So there was an organized march to the beach and a swim-in, which was met with violent opposition. And a number of these actions were like the marches downtown St. Augustine, especially at night. And the civil rights activists marched at night because more people could be involved. And of course, at night, more heinous acts happened. People were often beat with chains or bricks or fists or clubs. And all these things that happened in St. Augustine, most of which, as Bill spoke about, were captured on film. There were newspapers from different parts of the country and different parts of the world, and newspapers and television stations covered this. And so, because and thank God now for cell phones, they help somewhat about what's happening in the country in certain places. But because of this coverage, people across the country and across the world knew what was happening in St. Augustine, but not just in St. Augustine, but in the country. And the Civil Rights Bill was stalled in Congress, and because of all the visibility of what was going on in St. Augustine, they felt pressure to push it through in July of 1964. So I began this journey with the civil rights movement, but I've also discovered, they were both nationally known civil rights activists coming to St. Augustine. Dr. King came a few times, but there were also celebrities that would come through. I have images depicting Little Richard, who was known to come through he came through St. Augustine and performed at Oddfellows Hall, which is the same place Ray Charles used to go to perform. Ray Charles went to the Deaf and Blind School in St. Augustine, and he would sneak out and go to the clubs and play. And I think I don't know if it's on the website, but the Deaf and Blind School didn't exactly describe him as an ideal student. He's one of the greatest entertainers of all time. I also discovered that noted Harlem Renaissance painter Jacob Lawrence was stationed in the Coast Guard in St. Augustine. And he had his time there as well. And he did some phenomenal work while he was in St. Augustine. He had a commanding officer that knew of him. I think at that time he was probably already showing at the Whitney, but his commanding officer gave him space in his home to paint. So I have an image depicting that. Also discovered that Langston Hughes, another Harlem Renaissance celebrity writer, was in St. Augustine giving a talk at Florida Memorial Normal and Industrial College. So there are many, besides civil rights activists, there are many entertainers, and they're everyday folk who are some of the truest heroes. Because these were young people at the time in the 60s, but they were the ones involved in the marching and the protests, and literally putting their life on the line. I have an image here represents Miss Janie Price. Janie Price, who passed away a couple of months ago at the age of 96. She was an early civil rights activist. She was the first African-American nurse at Flagler Hospital. And she discovered that she was an RN, she discovered some of the white LPNs were making more than she was making as an RN. So she protested that, and they gave her the option of dealing with it or leaving, and she chose to leave. But she also chose to fight the system and advocated for the nurses that were still there to get equal pay. She had met Dr. King in Atlanta when she was going to Clark College, and he was going to Morehouse. I think then they called him Marty, maybe, or Mark, one of the two. He had a different nickname. But Martin had dated her roommate, so they became familiar. Many years later, when Dr. King became who he came to St. Augustine to speak, and he recognized Miss Janie in the crowd, and they reconnected. And she hosted Dr. King at her house on a couple of occasions when he came to town, both him and Ralph Abernathy. This image depicts Nurse Janie going to pick up Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy at the Jacksonville airport. And the Klan, who were watching, a lot of the active people in St. Augustine found out about it, and Janie came out from work one day and her car was flipped upside down. But shortly after that, she had the car right-sided, and she just drove it around to show her that she wasn't moved by that, show her strength of character. Janie also would field threatening calls to her house. The Klan would call and say, "We're coming to bomb your house," and she told me that she told them that, "Well, take off your hood and come on over. I'll be waiting for you." And they never showed up. They did show up at other houses in St. Augustine. There were a couple that were firebombed. But Janie, I had the great honor of photographing her in the fall, sitting on her porch, talking about the stories of her life, not just the civil rights actions, but stories of her life, and her hosting Dr. King, and sitting on the porch where Dr. King sat, and sitting in the living room where he sat, and having her tell firsthand accounts of what happened during the civil rights movement. It's something I'll never forget. I started a series of porch portraits, taking pictures of these civil rights activists or long-time Lincolnville residents, because the demographics of Lincolnville has changed dramatically in the last few years. So I started a series of portraits, just talking to these people, having them share their lives, and trying to honor them with a lovely portrait. We also have this image of Dr. King that represents Dr. King. You have to come up and take a look at it. He's standing outside of First United Methodist Church in St. Augustine, and he was physically escorted off the property when he was trying to worship there in 1964. Whoa. $725. Plus tax. I knew that was You got it. Thank you so much.
Plus tax.
and this was 1964. He used to, I understand he used to walk around this church at night and pray that things would change. In 2018, an African American pastor, a woman pastor from Jacksonville, was assigned to this church. She took over, and she wasn't exactly met with open arms, but she did her best. 6 months into her tenure there, she got a call from someone who wasn't a parishioner, but he wanted her to officiate at his mother's funeral. And he told the story of it was his grandfather that was one of the men that escorted Dr. King off the property in 1964. And he knew at the time there was something wrong with that, but he never got an answer. So many years later, in order to make that wrong right, he invited this black woman pastor to officiate at his mother's funeral. Powerful story.
And everybody's ready for questions.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, wrap it up. Okay, I thought we had 2 hours. We're talking 2 hours.